Eric Volz's beautiful ex-girlfriend, Doris, had been murdered. One of Doris's friends, he says, called with the news.
The tears start to pour, and, you know, how can this be? And it rocks the reality that you live in.
Eric had been preparing to move his magazine from Nicaragua to Costa Rica. But when he got that call, he says, he told his colleagues he wouldn't be leaving quite so soon after all. He rented a car in Nicaragua's capital, Managua, and 3 hours later he encountered the dreadful scene in tiny San Juan. Doris, dead, in the back room of her fashion boutique.
The police, they had the door open. People could kind of see in the back and see, you know, maybe her feet in the back of the store. And for decency, I was like, man, can't you at least shut the door?
Eric says he was told to stand on the street, where a hushed crowd had gathered.
It was a really ominous mood. And then I could see over the heads of the people this little blue storefront. And the police were coming in and out of it.
Tony D'Souza is a young writer from Chicago. He'd been enjoying some downtime after completing an award-winning novel, when, quite suddenly, this bizarre story began to unfold right in front of him.
I said to a guy right next to me, I said, you know, what happened? And he said, a girl raped and murdered.
Inside was the stuff of nightmares. The store up front had been ransacked and robbed. Signs of a struggle led back through a living area and into the bedroom, where police found the body. Doris had apparently been raped brutally and strangled, and her body hogtied and exposed. And her attacker or attackers didn't even stop there.
They stuffed her mouth so full of paper and rags that when they took that stuff out of her mouth and took pictures of her, it looked to me like her, you know, her jaw had been broken. I mean, it was just a brutal crime.
Eric began to think about funeral arrangements. He says he felt compelled to help. He found himself involved in the family's decision-making. At the time, it seemed to some of Doris's family that Eric was being a little pushy. After all, nobody invited him to be there. But Eric was into it now. He'd become a kind of amateur detective. The day after Doris was found murdered, Eric says, he discovered the police arrested 2 local men. And he knew them from the beach, 2 surfers named Julio Martin Chamorro and Nelson Dangla.
It's such a small town that if you asked who were the 2 most delinquent people, they would name these 2 people. And San Juan people did it. You know, they've said, you know, on record, we're not even surprised that it was Nelson and Julio Chamorro. That was the only thing they hadn't done, is killed somebody.
But why would they have murdered Doris? Eric continued his detective work, hoping to help the police solve the crime, he claims. He went to see the chief investigating officer, a strategy that was about to backfire.
He stops me in the middle of our conversation, and he tells me, Eric, you drink a lot, don't you? Do you get violent when you drink, Eric? And then he continued by saying, you know, you're a jealous guy. You know, would you kill somebody if if they cheated on you?
Eric says he was outraged by the policeman's accusations.
And I said, you know, I don't like your tone. You know, I know my rights, and you're speaking to me in an accusatory way.
He was also accusing you of murder.
Well, he didn't directly do it, but he was accusing me of somehow, you know, his tone. It was his tone.
Implying.
Yeah.
Later the same day, 2 days after Doris was murdered, it was time to bury her. Eric stepped in to help carry the coffin of his former girlfriend. He had no idea, of course, that this stint as a pallbearer would come back to haunt him. He was upset, he says, distraught.
What effect did it have on you?
I went through a lot of pain, you know, no answers, just that knot that you get in your stomach when you lose somebody, and, you know, definitely a lot of tears, a lot of sorrow.
His mourning was short-lived. Just after the funeral, that very day, they came for him. It was, he says, a complete surprise. A man in San Juan called Eric's mom, Maggie, back in Nashville.
He said, you need to excuse yourself and you need to find a quiet place because I have some terrible news to tell you about Eric. And I didn't know.
What did you think?
I didn't know what to think at that moment.
Eric had been arrested for the rape and murder of Doris Jimenez.
I was just in shock. I felt sick to my stomach. I felt like I was just going to throw up the whole time.
It was the day your life changed.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's never been the same since. Probably never will be either. It's devastating.
Eric was taken to a Nicaraguan jail to wait for his trial, and he says he was terrified.
All of a sudden, my life was being threatened, and I was in prison with killers and, violent criminals.
Tony D'Souza, the writer, saw a story breaking. He was on a loose contract with Outside Magazine. He called his editor.
I just knew it was going to be a big story. Because he was a U.S. citizen, a white guy, accused of killing a Nicaraguan girl.
The local press jumped all over it, or rather, all over Eric.
You were said to be arrogant, wealthy, arrogant, spoiled American kid who felt he could, kill with impunity a lovely local girl.
It was surreal for me to see the way that they were presenting me nationally.
In his only TV interview in prison, Eric says they presented him as a brutal killer. But was he? On December 7th, regional court was assembled here in Rivas, the provincial capital. A local judge prepared to hear the case. And outside, a crowd began to gather in the streets around the courthouse. And soon the crowd was huge and menacing. They were demanding Eric's head.
They were yelling.
The judge, after hearing Eric's defense, eased his pretrial imprisonment to house arrest. The crowd, waiting, heard this and was furious. Eric Volz was led out of the courtroom. And what came next was truly terrifying.
They had a machete or a club or a gun and were trying to kill him.